Inquisitor, what happened?
I am enlightened. Now I'll deal with these wretches.
Would they take our vows?
The duo of writer-directors Philip Gaylat and Morgan Galen King bring us The Spine of the Night, clearly influenced by the works of Ralph Bakshi. There was a little subgenre in the 80s of animated movies that were kind of fantasy-based kind of properties. And I'm not the biggest animation fan, to be honest with you, but I did enjoy these films. We're talking kind of the original Lord of the Rings animated movie, Wizards, the heavy metal movies, Fire and Ice, and things like this. And this movie is trying to emulate that kind of style of rotoscoped animation in this 2021 movie. That is actually a kind of anthology movie in some ways, maybe a semi-anthology movie, because there is a concurrent through line through the film. What is the story, you might be asking? So it takes place in a kind of a fantasy landscape, and it has various kind of segments through the movie that are detailing different kind of time periods. But ultimately, it has this kind of through line where we have a kind of an antagonistic force, shall we say, that takes the form of this particular guy, this kind of this kind of our antagonist, who's really the kind of the through line through this kind of series of kind of short films in a way. And you know, the world that this inhabits, there's these kind of special type of flowers ultimately that kind of imbue its owners with various kind of powers, and we see a variety of segments here, you know, going through kind of various kind of ages where this kind of guy, you know, gets ultimately this kind of power and uses it for, you know, egotistical means, absolute power, corrupts absolutely, and all that kind of stuff. And we have a variety of different kind of protagonists through this kind of movie, these different kind of segments kind of come up against him or that kind of force at least. And what will happen, you'll have to watch the movie to find out. So let's first of all discuss what I think works with this movie. So those of you who are fans of the aforementioned movies, as I've said, Fire and Ice, The Wizards, etc., I think we'll get a real kick of a modern movie taking cues from those style of films, even having the kind of the very kind of adult kind of style violence here, with people getting sliced open, heads getting cut off, gore, and, you know, people tromping around in the nude as well. Yes, there's plenty of cartoon nudity in this movie, both male and female, but it's not done in a kind of a sexual way. It's very much just kind of like they've got their bits hanging out. It's kind of like watching, you know, tribes and stuff on the kind of the Discovery Channel and things like this. So certainly not paid for kind of any type of sexual, you know, type of thing here. More of just a kind of a, you know, cavemen style kind of fantasy era aesthetic. But anyway, so it definitely has this kind of this adult theme in it, both in kind of nudity and kind of violence, which will please those of you who like those kind of very adult orientated kind of fantasy movies. And it does kind of remind you, the animation kind of style here, of those films, and it's something you don't really see much of these days. I actually quite like rotoscoped animation. I do feel it kind of has this realistic kind of feel to it in the way that people move, and even kind of if you're a fan of, for example, the original He-Man and the Masters of the Universe cartoon, a lot of their sequences were kind of done this way as well. So it has that sort of realistic kind of movement and kind of proportions in its kind of characters and things like that. So that was, you know, I personally kind of like it. This movie also takes a little bit of a different approach in having no real kind of central protagonist. Now we have this kind of this witch who is kind of, I suppose, you know, a protagonist that is present both through the middle and the end and the beginning, but she doesn't really have a lot to do until kind of the very end of the movie. But more on, we have an antagonist here who's the main kind of through line. So it's quite unique to have a movie where the focus is more on the kind of the antagonist than the actual any type of protagonist, which gives it a kind of a somewhat of a kind of a unique flavour. And as the kind of the movie progresses, as I say, it's like an anthology, so we kind of get a little story elements here and there, kind of going through different time frames as the kind of the technology kind of progresses and things like that. It's all kind of a fantasy movie, but for example, the last sequence is very kind of steampunk in a way. So I have to give the movie props for trying to kind of have a somewhat of a unique voice, I think, here. I have mixed feelings about the animation, to be honest with you. It is very on the plus side, it is very reminiscent of, as I've said, the aforementioned kind of old sort of style fantasy kind of animation that we've already talked about. So I did kind of appreciate seeing a movie kind of, use this kind of style of animation. And there are parts of it that I think kind of work quite well, and it's done quite stylistically. There are parts that aren't, we'll talk about that. But yeah, there are elements here that I think do work. It also has a pretty good voice cast, including kind of Lucy Lawless, Richard E. Grant, Joe Manganiello. So some kind of like bigger names here kind of doing some of the voice work. Okay, let's just maybe talk about what doesn't work for this film. Let me just kind of like dial back to the animation here. Although this movie does feel like it's kind of like the style of animation that we've talked about, these 80s kind of rotoscoped animation that we've seen before, it is lacking a certain something. I think the two problems I have with this style of animation and the art, I should say. So the animation and the art. The animation itself, when we kind of see fight scenes, for example, it's all very slow. So when we have, people fighting with sword versus sword and things like this, the way it's animated, it seems like almost like people are just casually kind of like throwing down a sword without any kind of real force. So it all seems very much like play acting in a weird way. Now I know obviously that it is acting, but to me the kind of the actors that were obviously doing the animations here really weren't giving it a particularly good performance in their kind of physical performances here, or the animation was just kind of too slow, because it's very sort of like just very low impact. And then we also have this tendency for people to just kind of like saunter along and kind of just like walk into swords and things like this. So the way this is animated, it seems a little bit kind of like just hashed together to a certain degree. The other thing more to do with the art style is, although obviously they kind of, what rotoscoping is, they film live action actors and then kind of like essentially draw over the kind of the images. So it kind of gives you the right proportions and the kind of the right movements. But the actual art style here reminds me more of the TV show Archer, but with that kind of rotoscope style animation that we've talked about in the kind of like the Ralph Bakshi movies and things like that. So it has this weird sort of modern aesthetic, but with this kind of 80s kind of style movie that doesn't quite work. And I think for the most part, this film is very plain in regards to the detailing. So we don't really ever get any shading. For example, when we see people's clothes, they're just kind of like blank clothes without any kind of like texture on and things like this. So the art style here is very disconcerting, and it seems ultimately quite cheap. Now, I suspect this movie is quite cheap and relatively kind of low budget, and that's all well and good, but it kind of looks cheap, and that therein lies the problem. It certainly doesn't have that grittiness that like movies like, for example, Fire and Ice, which I would say is its nearest comparison, to be honest with you. But that movie was, that's decades old, that film now. And this is a 2021 film, which really doesn't look as good as this film that was made decades ago using the same kind of technology. It feels like a colouring book version of that kind of that art style, and really, unfortunately, doesn't look all of that impressive. Well, there are a few scenes where I think it does, but for the most part, for me, I have to say I think the art style here was somewhat kind of lacking. I have to say as well, the story, although I appreciate the attempts to be somewhat kind of like original, focusing more of an antagonist's journey, I think that makes it so there's no one to really root for in this film. So you don't really have a central protagonist. Instead you have a small snippets with kind of different protagonists, but with all the same kind of bad guy, or at least the kind of the evolution of this kind of antagonist, so to speak. So you never really root for anyone, which means you're never really kind of like buying into the journey, so to speak. So I think this was a real oversight. Now, obviously, anthology movies do have the same issue, which is part of the reason why I have a problem with anthologies. But this is really only a semi-anthology because it does follow, again, a concurrent story, just with a variety of different protagonists. Different protagonists. So there's not really anyone to really latch onto. There's no sort of characters. I mean, the kind of the Swamp Witch, which I guess is the nearest thing we've got, has very little to do. Although she is the most present out of any protagonist, she doesn't really have a lot to do. There's also some very, very pretentious scenes, and I think this movie likes to think itself as high fantasy. But I gotta say, some of these sequences and the way this dialogue is written, it's very, very pretentious and very, very cheesy at times. The dialogue here feels very unnatural. Now, I think if these movies had come out in the 80s, you know, it probably would have fit right in, but it didn't. And I don't think you could have this very sort of trite dialogue, you know, not be picked apart in a modern film. I think you can get away with it. There's a certain amount of like, it was a product of its time when we could have looked back and, you know, watched these films that came out back then. But now I think you've got to be a bit smarter and, you know, having these kind of characters say very sort of cheesy dialogue and things like this, I think audiences aren't going to react to it as well. I mean, if you just are like a massive purist for those type of films, you may still appreciate, and I like those films, but to me this one kind of, it just seemed a little bit kind of like too cheesy in a way. And the story itself as well, this is just a little bit not as interesting. The whole thing with these kind of flowers and this ultimate power and how it corrupts and all of this, I don't think the narrative flow is particularly strong. Partially because its decision to have no real central protagonist, but partially I just don't think the narrative is told particularly well either. And I have to say, although there are some reasonable, recognisable names here in regard to some of the voice acting, I don't think the actors did a particularly good performance in some circumstances. And the kind of like the sort of mouthing of the kind of the words also looks quite a lot off at times as well. Overall, this movie is certainly ambitious, and I do think it might find an audience for those of you who really enjoy like the heavy metal films and Fire and Ice and such. But I don't think it's as good as those movies, to be honest. It feels like somewhat of a cheap cousin of those type of films, and it just looks cheap and kind of not as detailed and not as interesting, not as action-packed. The action sequences are weaker, not as thrilling. All around feels like a very kind of low impact version of those films. But not without merit. There is merit here still to be said, I have to say. It's going to be a 4 out of 10, a below average movie, but not a car crash, I would say. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.